An hour and a half to get a motor out of one of these cars, not bad.
Look out!
Hey everybody, John with J Hunto's Garage. Today I'm prepping the 06 HHR to take the engine out again. This is literally the definition of common hand tools. This is a 15mm socket, 1/2 inch drive. That comes in handy on the exhaust manifold bolts. And 13mm, 3/8, 13 breaker bar, exhaust manifold bolts, hose clamps, and then miscellaneous bolts and whatnot. This speed handle is really good for your ignition coil bolts as well as your valve cover bolts. Screwdriver didn't use too much. This just in case you need to get connectors off. You saw what I was talking about with this guy. 15mm, 15, so 15, 13, 10. And there is also, I don't have out here, 1/4 inch drive ratchet with an 8mm socket specifically for the starter, the small wires on the starter. Alright, to get this engine ready to come out, I'm going to need tools and tape. I'm going to start with taking off the air cleaner and disconnecting all the electrical connections and labeling them. So I'm going to need tape and a good marker. That's basically how you do it. Some of the things just naturally fall where they're supposed to, like the coil pack or the individual coil connectors. They're all in line on the harness, so you're not gonna mix these up. That'll be easy. And then just get the harness out of the way where it's not going to cause a problem coming out. Not everything's disconnected yet, but almost. Okay, when it comes time to removing your bolts, you want to use a Ziploc bag. This one happens to have a white label on it, so I'm going to write on that label exactly what this bolt goes to. Now if you're doing a bigger job, you want to use the big freezer bags because you could have cylinder head bolts or just a lot of bolts, so you want to use a bigger bag for that. Now if you put other bolts in here, because you can see it's a pretty big bag for only 2, they do make smaller bags, but if you put other bolts in here, just make sure you label what they go to. Okay, in case you didn't know, this hard line goes from the purge valve down to the intake manifold. It's basically a vacuum line. They have this really neat quick release feature here. Really cool for taking these off. Don't forget to label it. Another tip for taking these things off and making sure they go back the same way they came off, put your label on the end that this goes to. So this goes to the purge valve, so I'm just going to put this on that end that actually goes to the purge valve. This makes it so much easier when you're putting everything back together. Don't forget to store things in a bin or on some shelves somewhere where you don't get them mixed up with other parts. It's perfectly fine to abbreviate. Just a side note, these are the fuel injectors. For those who don't know, this car has approximately 220,000 miles on it. These are the original injectors, and the thing still runs fine. Go Chevy. Here's a nice little tool from Performance Tool. It's a short, light-duty ratchet with 3/8 drive on one side and 1/4 inch drive on the other side for small access places that are hard to get to. It does okay. Special bolts you want to take care of or keep track of, you want to go ahead and label those individually before you put them, make sure that doesn't come out of there, into a bag with other bolts. So in this one, I've got intake manifold, fuel rail, and now I have the one for the dipstick bracket, which goes on the intake manifold, which is right here. It's the intake manifold. It goes right there. So it's kind of a specialized bolt. It's very short. I don't want to put a longer one in there. I have to fight with that because it's kind of hard to get to. So best to label it. Okay, all the wiring is disconnected and labeled, and including taking the intake manifold off, which is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolts, bagging and tagging and labeling. This took roughly an hour. Next, you'll need to disconnect the computers. There's 3, 4 connections here, and you cannot get these on incorrectly, so that's good, and no need to label. If you got a bolt like this scenario with the alternator, you can see I've labeled it, taken that off, and then rather than putting the nut in a bag, I'm going to go ahead and put it right back on there. Okay, the next steps I'm going to do are remove the alternator, remove the serpentine belt in the opposite order I just said, and drain the oil and drain the coolant. Then take off the hoses, the bolts for the transmission, and the coolant bottle. That's got to come out, and the motor mount that's on that side. And down in the back there's 2 bolts, I believe, that connect the transmission to the engine. It kind of acts like a motor mount, and you got to make sure you get those off, or else this will not come out. Otherwise, we're probably 15-20 minutes from taking it out. So an hour and a half to get a motor out of one of these cars, not bad. One other thing, I'm going to take the alternator off, set it aside because it'll get in the way of coming out, and I'm also going to take off the air conditioning but not disconnect the refrigerant lines. I'm just going to set it aside, use zip ties or something to hold it out of the way to give clearance for the engine to come out. I'm also going to disconnect the heater hoses, as well as remove the exhaust manifold in the back and the exhaust, disconnect the exhaust system from the exhaust manifold. You have to do that to get that out. Otherwise, she's good to go. Look out! Because I use anti-seize lubricant on everything, I have had no issues with bolts that are stuck, rusted, or anything I gotta drill out. Anti-seize lubricant, it works. While you're doing this, you have to watch for stuff like this. You see this hose and that nook or nick in it? That is part of the air conditioning. And this right here is an indentation from it wearing on something, from vibration. So whatever this is rubbing up against is going to cause a hole right in that. I'd say that is getting dangerously close to the inside of that tube where this is going to leak big time. So when putting this back together, I'm going to make sure that I have proper clearance in between there and whatever it's up against, probably something on the intake manifold, to make sure that that doesn't hit anything ever again, or to make sure that that doesn't rub up against anything. This is what I've used so far for taking out the engine. Okay, all the fluids are drained, the exhaust manifold's off, the intake manifold's off, all the cables are disconnected and labeled, and I've just got one more thing to get off, which is that purge valve solenoid right there, and she's ready to come out, besides that motor mount right there. So next episode, I'm going to rent a hoist and get this guy out of here and proceed to pull the transmission. Alright, I'm going to be honest. There's one more thing you got to disconnect, which I haven't done yet, and that is the oil cooler hoses. There's two of them. The coolant goes through there, and the coolant hoses in the back for the heater, and the lower radiator hose, which is right here, which goes back to the thermostat. You got to disconnect those two before it'll come out. So, moral of the story is, give everything another good thorough look over before you go yanking it out. Alright, when you're taking off the hoses at the oil cooler, this is the one that's got to come off. This other one just connects back to the thermostat housing, so that's not being removed, so you can leave that on. You will have to disconnect the large hose. Alright, your wiring just moves around however you need it. Just don't pull on anything real hard. Your lower radiator hose comes up this way and goes back to your thermostat housing back there. That you will have to take off at the thermostat housing. Don't take it off at the radiator. That's going to be a pain. And there's one more electrical that you got to get off here. Electrical wire right here, which is a ground. That is, I believe, one of two. First one's over here, where that bolt is coming out of the block. Then this one over here. So just unbolt it, label it, block ground, something like that, and then put your nut back on. And then get ready to pull it out. Of course, disconnecting your motor mounts, which there's one right there. There's one up here, and then there's one on the back of the down by the transmission that has two bolts to it. You'll see. Don't forget your heater hoses.